all. Welcome back to the Agronomists here after a week off for, that pesky little election, or as I like to call it, Free Pencil Day. All right. I am your host, Lyndsey Smith, for this episode of the Agronomists. We're going to have a really great show tonight. Plenty of things on the docket to talk about. Shout out, though, to Ken, who's just enjoying the intro music. I got to tell you, Ken, our producer, Jay, he's pretty good at picking some really good tunes to intro all these things. All right, so before we get started, of course, we do have to remind everybody for following along tonight and watching this program, you can qualify for CEU credits if that is your jam. So make sure to head to realagriculture.com/agronomists tomorrow morning to sign in, hit that post, hit that landing page, and let us know that you followed along and make sure you get your credit. And hey, Ray's here too. Okay, so this episode is a little more Western Canadian focused. The last one we had was more Eastern. We, of course, welcome all and all questions, but we are going to drill down and focus quite significantly here on the West and what's happening, of course, with harvest, post-harvest, and what's happening in the soil. That's maybe the biggest one. Okay, so I will bring in my guests. It is my great pleasure to have Jack Payne and Jason Voogt here. So Jack is with South Country Co-op, 10 locations south of Highway number 1 in Alberta, here to serve you. And Jason, this is your second time, at least, I think, on the Agronomist.
Yep.
Is it your second or
The
third?
second time.
All
Yep.
right, from field to field agronomy out of Carmen, Manitoba, everybody's favorite research station. There you go. Okay. And more. Yes. All right. So now, thank you to both of you for joining me. This has been an incredibly challenging growing season for many farmers. It has, in fact, wrapped up as far as harvest goes, or we're just about there. But that just, of course, leaves us time to get the field work done. And boy, is there a lot to do. So, Jason, I'll start with you. Just a quick sort of update of what things look like for your clients in your neck of the woods right now as far as harvest goes.
Right. So right now, I would say that we're pretty much done all the cereals and canola. We're primarily into, I would say, about 80-90% of the soybean harvest is done. That's been the big push lately. And actually, we have a few growers into corn as far as grain corn harvest. And we've been desiccating sunflowers as well. So we're kind of getting to that tail end of harvest, and things are progressing well with the really good weather.
All right. Okay. And I just want to quickly point out, Peter Johnson, the center of Canada, actually, the closest town is Landmark, Manitoba, where I went to high school. So you're welcome. That is the geographic center of Canada. All right. And Jack, you, of course, southern Alberta, didn't exactly get any rain this year, but you did have a lot of wind. But where are things at right now?
Well, we got wind today, so yeah, really harvest. I guess you look at the bad news, good news. The bad news was the drought, lower than anticipated yields. On the upside, it has been a tremendous fall. I mean, so at least quality wise, the crop has come off very, very well. We're way ahead of schedule with harvest. Pretty much all the cereals and oil seeds are wrapped up. In the irrigated areas, they are now getting into the row crops, the sugar beets, the potatoes. Some of the dry beans are coming off. But even in central Alberta, harvest has wrapped up. I've seen a number of people that have wrapped up, and that's way ahead of schedule. There are some areas in northern Alberta that got some more rain, and they're still waiting to get some of their canola off. But by and large, the cereals are pretty much all off. So we've had a really good run this fall for sure.
Now, this is going to be my plug, and Jason, you might want to cover your ears, but this is going to be my plug for an open fall does not mean recreational tillage. All right, everybody? You can do nothing. It's okay to not. Yeah, there you go. Yeah, Lara does share de Mozak Farms in Saskatchewan in her area where family farmers finished over the weekend. So I did ask when she did share that this week if that was the earliest. And she said one of, but the very earliest, remind me of the year, Lara, was of course the year that they didn't really have a harvest. So not the worst, but nice to be done in some areas. And that does open us up for proper field work. So there you go. That's what we're going to talk about. So I'm going to go to tonight's first clip relatively early because I think that there is a lot to talk about on the nutrient front. Mm-hmm. What's actually left in the soil, making sure we're soil testing. How do we actually manage for this in 2022? So we're going to go to Ross McKenzie. We're going to listen to this isn't that old of an interview, but it's a really great, I think, just a setup for soil testing management in general and why that matters even more this year. So, producer Jay, if you could roll the clip of Ross McKenzie.
We'll start right from the very beginning, the value of soil testing. If you don't know what's in the soil for nutrients, it's hard to make very expensive decisions.
Yeah, so if you don't soil test, you're kind of using the old buy guess and buy golly method. And when that's, in this day and age, when you're spending $600,000 for a combine or $500,000 for a tractor, and often farmers' fertilizer bills are $200,000, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, you want to take a little bit of time to evaluate your field in terms of soil fertility so you can spend that fertilizer dollar wisely. And that's really the main purpose of soil testing, is to really wisely spend your fertilizer dollar.
So, knowing all that, why do you think we're still having to have conversations about, hey, you need to soil test?
Well, I think a lot of farmers have found that they use similar rates of fertilizer year after year, and they figure they know their fields, but you always want to be double checking to make sure things aren't changing, and because things will change slowly over time. So that's one thing, but then there's also the concern that farmers have had that, well, the soil testing lab is quite variable from year to year. Is it really that accurate? So, but for the most part, most labs do a fairly good job of their analysis. So lab variability is not really the key issue. The key issue is making sure you take a really good sample that's going to be representative of your field. And with field variability, depending on where you take your samples, you can wind up with quite different results. So you have to be very careful in how you sample to make sure the information you get is going to be good, and then you can use it to make good fertilizer recommendations.
Well, and I think also too, there's the decision in the year, right, in the growing season, or thinking, I'm going to plant canola, I'm going to plant wheat. Here's what I need. But there's also understanding the long-term trends of what's in your soil too, right? Because
exactly,
we're seeing across parts of North America where levels are declining in some of these, right, in the major nutrients.
Yep, and as we do more fertilizer research, the better of our understanding on things too. For example, 25 years ago, we didn't use much sulfur fertilizer, but as we grow crops like canola that have a higher demand and we have higher yields across the board for all our crops, it's become more important to include that nutrient in many cases for farmers. So our understanding is much better now than it was 20 or 30 years ago.
Yeah, okay, so we're now here at the end of October. Is it too late for parts of Western Canada to do soil testing at this point?
To be honest, in my mind, this is the perfect time to be doing it. The advantage is that our soils are really cooling off now, so microbial activity is slowing down. So there hopefully, will be not much change in your soil nutrient status from now through till spring. So right now, in my mind, is really the best time to sample. If you sample in early September and the soils are moist and warm, a lot of things can happen, a lot of changes can take place from early September to late October. So this is really the perfect time to sample.
So we've collected our samples, we have them. Is there anything we need to know about handling before we get it to the lab?
Okay, so you've gone to the point of getting those 0 to 6, 6 to 12, and 12 to 24 inch depth. So you've got that in 3 different buckets, and you've got 20 to 30 quarters that have been put into those buckets. You want to mix them up very, very well, break them down, and then take about a 2-pound sample from each of those buckets. And then if you want to send those samples to the lab immediately when they're still moist, then in my opinion you need to be putting those into a cooler and keeping them less than 5 degrees, shipping them to the lab overnight so the lab gets them the next day, spread those samples out and dry out. If you have them in a container, especially if they're in a plastic bag and they're moist, and then you leave them in your shop for 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 days, then the microbes are still working and they become anaerobic, and you can change the chemistry, what's really there. So if you can't send the samples in a cooler to the lab overnight, then take them back to your shop, spread them out in plastic containers and or aluminum trays very well. Let them air dry over the next day or two, then package them up and send them to the lab. And also make sure that there's no cats or things like that might get into them to contaminate them.
Oh, those pesky shop cats.
so it's important to either send them to the lab immediately in coolers, kept cool, or to dry them and then send them to the lab.
Well, that was only slightly terrifying. My screen froze while I was away. And now maybe it is too. But that's okay. We're going to roll with it. Peter wants me to let the two of you speak. which he's not wrong. But I wanted to start with to both of you. So that clip, of course, was a little later in the year, a few years ago. But here we are. We're nearing the end of September. Either one, but maybe Jason, I'll start with you. Are you soil testing yet, or is it still too warm, too early?
Yeah, it's a bit of a struggle because we've actually started soil testing about a month ago. And what we try to do is balance between the information that we get from North Dakota State, from Dave Franson, which he talks about, soil testing behind the combine. And a lot of that is due to the fact that guys haven't worked their fields. So you get a really good uniform sample. So very good representation. And with being so dry this year, a lot of guys haven't worked their fields. The other challenge with that, though, is it's warm. There probably is still microbial activity going on, but we've still been on the drier side, even with some recent rains in August, that I think we won't see generally that much change between now and freeze up unless we get another big amount of rain. The other side of that, too, is logistics. Because of how dry things have been this year, there's a lot more growers that are coming to us wanting their fields tested. So logistically, there's no way, even if every retail, Cargill, Richardson, Nutrient, Co-op had a testing unit going, there was no way we'd get through everything in time before freeze up or before next spring. So there is a bit of I guess, an area there where we have to start at some point. Even logistically, it's what we have to do.
Mm-hmm. All right, and Jack, in your neck of the woods?
I would agree. So much of what we do in farming is compromise, right? I mean, we know what the best recommendation is. We know what the best scenario is. A lot of what we have to do, though, is to compromise. And I would agree with those comments. I mean, we've done soil sampling starting in mid-September, knowing that maybe it's not the ideal time, but it really does refer back to the logistics of being able to get all of those samples in because, if you follow 4R nutrient stewardship, the best time to soil sample, of course, the absolute best time is about a week to 2 weeks before seeding. Well,
Exactly.
there's just absolutely no way that we would ever get the samples done. So what's the next best time? And that's actually on the 4R site, is any time you can get a sample. So, some soil sampling is better than none. And I guess just to kind of build on the comments, John Hurd with Manitoba Agriculture, I don't have the data handy, but he did some work a few years ago where they actually compared sampling in September, early September, mid-September, into October, November, and then compared it to spring. And in many cases, there was a slight bit of difference, but it wasn't, how would I say, so out of whack that you wouldn't be able to use those samples. So, it's a bit of a game of compromise, but we have chased combines out of the fields, and again, having some data and some information to build off of is better than waiting too long. And the other thing is, who knows what the weather's going to do? That's the other thing. I'm just speaking as an old timer, but I've got this gut feel that we've had just an incredible fall. Where like today we were plus 25. It's just phenomenal. I think there's going to be a day that soon, and the door is going to slam shut on us, and we're going to wake up to minus 15 or minus 20 and 6 inches of snow. Not that I'm a meteorologist, but I live in Alberta, so yeah.
Mm-hmm. I would agree with that entirely.
Yeah. So now Peter does want to know, Jason, have you gone back after, let's say, some of those early fields? Have you gone back to compare once things have gotten colder to do a bit of a check on how close you are?
Yeah, and I would agree. You would, in the case where you get quite a bit of moisture from the time that you did your first sample to the second one. Right now, the ones that we've done earlier on, we've maybe seen a couple inches of rain, but because we're so dry, I don't see there being that much of a change. But if we were to get 2019 kind of scenario here, where we had like 13 inches of rain in September, and then like, oh man, 2 feet of like heavy wet snow, yeah, in that kind of situation, I would definitely want to retest because I know in that situation. Even things like chloride, which is mobile, like nitrates, we saw like zero um, chloride in that profile because a lot of it had leached down because of all that water. So in that situation, yeah, for sure.
All right. And yes, Warren, my internet is being ridiculous today. So I will throw it back to the two guests as quickly as possible. But why this year, more than perhaps any other year, are these soil tests going to be so valuable?
Go ahead,
Well,
Jack.
okay, I will. Sure, I'll start off. Well, a couple of things. One is, with drought, and I guess that's the other thing is this drought this year, so widespread. It is so widespread, and for many of us that are been around the block a few times, this really almost is very reminiscent of 1988. We've had pockets of drought. I've covered Alberta for over 30 years, and we've had pockets of drought. We had pockets of drought in southern Alberta in 2017. We had pockets of drought in 2018, 2019. The Medicine Hat area was really nailed with a drought in that area. So we've had pockets of drought off and on throughout Alberta, over the past 20 years. I think 2001, 2002 was another drought cycle. It got even to central Alberta. But this one is widespread. So, I mean, it's right across from east to west and huge in magnitude. Um, so the good news, bad news is, of course, the bad news is we had reduced yields. The good news is, though, because we've had reduced yields, you had reduced crop uptake or utilization of those nutrients. So there should be some carryover. The other aspect is because it has been so dry, nutrients, for example, nitrogen, you're not going to have much leaching occurring. You're not going to have much denitrification occurring in saturated soils. So much of that nitrogen that was applied in the spring should still be there, and so that's the good news. Now we're coming into the perfect storm, and I don't want to sound like a negative Nelly, but I'm sure every grower knows what's been happening with fertilizer prices this fall, and we've got the perfect storm there. We're seeing astronomically high prices with fertilizers, and of course Hurricane Ida has not helped the situation. But we're looking at record high prices for urea, for phosphate, even potash is high. So as a commodity or as a nutrient becomes more valuable or more precious, you want to do a better job of managing it. So the time is right and if there was ever a fall to look at soil sampling and soil testing, this is the one to do it, because first we got really good weather. So far, our forecast is going to hold for the next 2 to 3 weeks by the looks of it. So we've got some prolonged good weather coming up. So it's going to give us ample time to get in the field and get those samples. Yes, it is dry currently. So just referring to the comments we mentioned earlier, maybe not a lot of things may not change too much in terms of soil chemistry or nutrient levels because there's not a lot of mineralization occurring. And we got the time to get in the fields, and now is the time to soil sample and soil test, because you're possibly going to have some high residual levels, and fertilizer is a very precious commodity that we want to manage very well. So things are looking up on that end for soil sampling this fall.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
I'll hop in just before because Jason, I do want to get your thoughts on this too. But Josh Linville just tweeted out before the broadcast here that China has effectively put a cap on or stopped phosphate exports through to June 22, which they account for 30% of phosphate world trade. Wow. So if it was expensive before, hold my beer. Okay, so Jason, I'll go to you. Same conversation, really. Why this year soil testing more than any other?
Exactly, and that's it. It pretty much mirrors exactly what Jack had said. We've got a very large area of Manitoba. It's not quite as widespread as what we would say happened in 1988 here, because we do have pockets within our south central region, and even southeastern Manitoba received a few more rains that helped with getting them a close to average crop. But the challenge this year was the heat. The heat and the timing of that heat was just unreal. And what that did was definitely impact yield. And so when you impact yield in that way, regardless of whether you have adequate moisture or not, it's definitely going to affect the uptake. And because of that, we realize with the decreased yields that we've seen, we're going to have a lot more residual nutrients in the soil. And so, guys, growers realize that. And because of that, too, and as Jack mentioned, too, fertilizer prices, they're a lot more in tune to say, you know what, we need to really look at what's in the soil. I definitely most of the time try to encourage a grower to soil test every year, and I equate it to a bank account. I tell them, you know, you're putting money into a bank account, you're taking it out. Do you ever stop to check and see what's there? And most of the time they'll say, well, yeah, I do. Well, okay. Is the soil any different? I mean, even if you don't do it every year or every field every year, it's a good idea to do it every once in a while, or maybe a third of the farm, because you have to know what's happening there. It all begins at the soil. So that's a lot of what's going on right now, and why we're seeing the increased amount of soil testing happening.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned, Jason, and this ties into Lara's comment as well. You mentioned, of course, the range of residual you're seeing across fields and between fields. And so Lara's question, when you're planning that soil test, which is best in the hopes to save money next year, benchmark sampling, grid, or composite sampling?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if there's an answer to this one, but I'll put it to both of you.
This is where, and I was going to talk about this later if it ever came up, but there's an art and a science when it comes to soil testing. I see Jack nodding his head because he agrees too, right? And there's a lot coming up now with the art, right? Most of what we do is random composite testing, GPS reference, so we can kind of take a little bit of that variability out there. But if you can get to benchmark or zones even, it's going to give you a lot better idea of what to do. But even if a grower was able to go into just doing a random composite, and it's something that they can do year to year, same time of year, to kind of take a little bit of that variability, is going to help them, give them a little bit of idea how to plan for that. And what we're running into now is, because we have such large amounts of residual N in some cases, it's okay. The challenge now is, how much of that N can we actually rely on to feed that crop next year, to set our targets for then what we want to apply for fertilizer? And that's the art part of it.
Jack, your thoughts?
I would agree. Yeah, whatever strategy you use for sampling, whether it be benchmark, whether it be composite, we didn't mention grid. That's something that's used in the U.S. When I was with Alberta Agriculture, I did a project one year where we compared grid sampling to benchmark or zone sampling, and it was a huge make work project. It's just not scalable to do grid. So if you're doing benchmark or composite, that's great. One of the things that Ross maybe didn't mention in his video is try to stick to the same soil testing lab as well when you're sending in samples. Because if you're comparing, one of the frustrations we found years ago was a grower would soil sample and send it to one lab, and then a year later or 2 years later send it to a different lab. And if the labs are using different extraction methods, and different labs will use different methods, you can certainly, well, Jason, you could sample a field, I could sample a field on the same thing. If we send it to two different labs, we could come back with apples and grapefruit, even if we used georeferencing where we took the cores from, right?
Exactly.
So that's another one to consider. So if you're happy with the lab that's been giving you the results you've gotten so far, please stick with it. That will just remove that variability out of the equation.
Okay. There is another part to that video where he does actually go into the different extraction methods and asking your lab which one they use. So that is a really good point that realistically you should know, because one of them works better for Alberta, one of them works better for Manitoba, and then Ontario, of course, is like Quebec. It's its own world. Anyway, that was for you, Peter. Okay, so that question though of art and science, what factors will you use to apply the art of nutrient credits, Jason? So you mentioned this, right? How much of that N can you rely on for next year?
I really open I opened
Darn.
myself up to that one, didn't I? With Peter being online, of course he's going to do this. He's going to make me actually think, right? So I get it. So what it comes down to right now is we have to look at a number of different factors: soil texture, whether we're dealing with heavy clays or sands, and positionally where that specifically, let's say nitrogen is 0 to 6, 6 to 24, where it is, right? And on top of that is also available moisture. Right now, our subsoil is really depleted. So when I look at that, I realize, you know what? And the other part of it I should mention is the crop that we're growing. So I can pretty much count on that top 0 to 6 being there for whatever crop I'm going to grow. Beyond that, that's where the art comes in, right? And that's where it comes back to the soil texture, the crop that you're growing, rooting depth that the crop has. But a lot of it is going to come back to moisture. And that's something we just don't know what we're going to have. And so from that, we kind of come up with a bit of I got an idea of what we think the percentage is of that 6 to 24 inch nutrient availability is that's going to be there for that next crop. And then base our recommendation for fertilizer based on that.
Now, Jack, I'm going to go back to you because I want to talk about phosphorus a little bit. And you did send some slides. And I want to talk about soil pH a little bit.
Sure.
In that, right? Because so there's this interplay between, of course, dry soils and how that can impact chemical properties in the soil. So walk me through that process on what that might mean for phosphate availability for next year as well. So producer Jay, I think it's slide 5. I think it's slide 5 I'm referring to, but maybe Jack has this. Nope. It's the one with the pink and purple graphs.
There we go.
There you go.
Perfect. Yeah. So, just to build on that is what we will, and this is historical data. So, I've been very fortunate to work with some mentors that have guided me through my career. Ross McKenzie was one of them. When I was with Alberta Agriculture, the 12 years I was with them, I got to work beside Ross. I learned a great deal from him. Another person who was very influential in my career was Regis Karamanos. And Regis at one point was actually my supervisor when I was with Wesco Fertilizer. And we've maintained relationships over the years. And so Regis has got a huge background, in terms of Western Canada, because he used to manage the Saskatchewan Soil Testing Lab at the University of Saskatchewan. And so what's on this slide, actually, I borrowed from Regis. It's historical data. And again, what it does is just reinforces. And somebody say, wow, this is from the 80s and 90s. It's not applicable. Well, yes, it is, because we learn from things that have happened previously. But on this slide, what you're seeing is basically the trends that Regis took from some of the data that he over the years. And what you'll notice is in a drought year, you do see a lower pH. And that's because the soluble salts and the solution are not leached out by the rainfall, and we end up with a higher hydrogen ion concentration. The higher the hydrogen ion concentration, the lower the pH. It's the power of hydrogen. And typically what they found, and this is, Regis went back and went into the data that they had from the lab and found that when you had dry years, for example, 1988 and in the 1990s, where you had a low pH, of course, that affects phosphate availability, because typically phosphate becomes more available in slightly acidic conditions. And so if your pH drops, you may see an increase in phosphate levels. And that's what he actually measured in some of this data. Now, that may only be temporary. It may only last for a couple of years until the equilibrium changes again when we start getting more and more precipitation, better moisture conditions. But I would say, and actually, I'm not sure, Jason, if on your soil test reports that you've seen, but some of the ones that I've seen come across my computer the past couple of weeks, I'm seeing some low pHs out of areas that typically would have a pH of, in the 7.5. And it seems that trend is there again. So, you got to realize that everything in the soil, whether it's biological or even a chemical reaction, is driven by water or lack of water. and that's certainly going to have an influence on the chemical and biological properties of the soil.
Fantastic. And this, of course, in my mind, just makes all the soil geeks out there very, very happy. So, Lara, you're welcome. But this is, of course, where the art and the science meet. There is a mountain of science to sort of sift through, but then ultimately we have to make decisions in a couple months, really, as to what's going in the ground and how much of it and where it's going to be and in what form and all those sorts of things. So as much as we'd love to go over this and comb through it all, we do also at some point just have to make decisions. So I do want to switch gears a little bit. No, we're not at the next clip, so don't ask. But I really, we touched on it a couple weeks ago, just briefly on some of the weed control questions. We talked about reflowering canola, some regrowth that was happening from shattered pods and heads because it was so dry, and then we got moisture. And oh my goodness, I will say I didn't think weed control was going to be a big question this fall, but Jason, especially in your area, that's proving completely untrue. And so tell us a bit about what you're seeing out there in the fields right now.
Yeah, exactly. And so here's what's happened, right? We are typically an area that we love tillage, right? Most of the time, not all the time, right? But you're right. I mean, I even remember a grower last year that was out tilling his field in, I don't know, November, and just because he was bored. Uh, we're not going to see that this year. So what's happened is a lot of fields have been left in stubble untouched, and so they maybe been harrowed after combining, but they've basically been untouched. So we get these rains in late August and September. It's caused all this regrowth, right? So volunteer growth from canola and cereals, in particular, a lot of regrowth on canola from basically the canola stems themselves. But we're also seeing regrowth of weeds, so perennials, other weeds like kochia, those type of things happening. And so with that, we've seen a lot more post-harvest weed control application happening this year than we've seen in probably a number of years. And we're not typically an area that does a lot of that because, yeah, we use iron to basically control anything that's growing in the fall. So we've seen that now. And what that's brought up now is your weed control strategy going into this fall and what you're going to use. So many guys just fall back to using straight glyphosate, and what that's happened is really showed the resistant weeds that we have out there to group 9, in particular kochia. And I cannot believe the amount of kochia we have around this year and fields that we've never seen before. And now when we go and apply a post-harvest, and the thing with post-harvest is when that kochia regrows after being cut from the harvest, whether it be swathing or straight combining, it's producing a lot less leaf area and a lot more seed head than what you would see prior to harvest. So there's also a little bit more of a logistic issue there too, as far as getting enough product onto the plant. But what we've been seeing is a lot of resistance showing up, and trying to get growers, or trying to encourage them to add a tank mix partner to that glyphosate to help with controlling those weeds and any other weeds that are out there.
Mm-hmm. Now, I think, Jay, we've got a photo that Jason had sent of the kochia, that the ones that had grown or some control and then not at all. We'll see if we can pull it up here, because I think it, especially for any of those listening or watching that don't have kochia plants, ta-da! Yeah, not a lot of fun.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah,
and so what you'll get there is kochia being an outcrossing plant. What will happen sometimes is you'll see dead plants, but then you'll see green ones that are like completely untouched. But then you'll get something in kind of in between, right? Because it has maybe some level of resistance, some level of susceptibility. But what you'll see is this kind of pattern within fields, and especially if you see a pattern in the fields of their distribution of seed as they roll or tumble through the field. And then as a grower applies that herbicide, if it's, let's say, straight glyphosate, you're going to get some susceptible plants and some that might actually be resistant.
So now, Jack, being in southern Ontario, Alberta, and it being so dry, I know that this past year in the winter there was just so much soil loss and soil movement from wind erosion. And I know that it is always a concern in that area, but this past year, even fields that hadn't been touched were still blowing because it was just so dry
Mhm.
and so windy. So what is the strategy then in those areas that are still dry? If the crop is off, do you let those weeds grow a little and then spray them so that you have something to hold? What's the fall weed control strategy there?
So here we go again with art and science. What's the best thing to do given the circumstances that you've got? Well, first of all, moisture is very precious. It's like Les Henry says, stored soil water is like money in the bank. And so, yeah, we've had the same situation here. We 3 weeks ago, we got some rains. Now we got these great growing high temperatures. Weeds are going like crazy. Volunteers growing like crazy. And we got to remember that those plants are growing and they're taking that water out of the soil. So those weeds are robbing that moisture. And the other thing is, some of those established weeds, if they're regrowing, they've got some big root systems, and so they're pulling water and nutrients out of the soil. And even if you've got, let's say, a carryover of nutrients, some of those nutrients are then going into that plant material. They're not going to be lost, but then we're going to have to wait for that plant material to decompose to re-release those tied up nutrients that have gotten locked into that weed growth. So you might have a carryover of nitrogen and phos, but maybe some of it now is tied up in some of that weed material. So what I know it's a difficult question, and for some of the fields that have got very, very little residue on them, certainly we're not seeing tillage occurring. If it's left as it is, that's probably the best thing. But it is a fine line. So do I control the weeds? Do I let them grow? Are they really going to provide any kind of windbreak or protect the soil? Well, really, to get enough, if you're thinking of a cover crop where the weeds or the volunteer is going to become a cover crop, to really prevent any wind erosion, especially in southern Alberta, you'd need a lot of growth, which is going to take a lot of water out of the soil and tie up the nutrients. And most guys are just going in and saying, "Hey, we're gonna burn those weeds down. We're going to spray them and leave it as is." And even in central Alberta, where it's very similar to what Jason has, a lot of guys would be getting in there with tillage to look after it. You know what? In central Alberta, it may be very similar to some areas in Manitoba. I got to dry the soil out. It's too wet. I got to dry it out to get in there. It's dry, baby. You don't have to worry about drying it out. And I'm seeing actually even in central Alberta, a lot of fields now are just being producers are going in with the sprayer and taking that weed growth, that volunteer out with herbicides, and that's very prudent on their part.
Yep, 100%.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, without Ray throws out the term situational management. I like that term. No one answer can fit for everyone. Ray, it's like you've been doing this a while. Okay. No, I really do like that. Okay, there's no hope of getting to all three clips tonight, but I do want to bring in, I think we'll watch, now this is quite a few years old. I think it's 8 years old, with Angela Brackenreed. This was when we first discovered canola or clubroot in canola in Manitoba, and when we were first sort of getting out there and encouraging farmers to go out there and clip stems. So we will watch this one, but really I want us to think about what has changed between then and now, and what we're doing for clubroot scouting or other disease scouting post-harvest, for sure. All right. Okay, so Jay, if we can roll the Angela Brackenreed clip, please. Unfortunately, we need to talk about clubroot. In Manitoba, it's in Alberta. Farmers need to be looking for this, scouting for this. Angela, walk us through what we need to look for.
Okay, well, Lyndsey, the reality is in Manitoba, the spore load is going to be fairly low. So those above ground symptoms may not be all that obvious. Really, we should be out a little bit earlier than we are right here. But the reality is in Manitoba, what you're probably going to be seeing is symptoms on the roots that are fairly early, like the onset of that symptoms might be fairly early. So those above ground symptoms might not really be showing up. So digging and looking at the roots is probably the first thing you should be doing. If you have an entrance in your field that you typically use, what I would recommend is checking that area first, because this is where you're going to be trafficking in most of that soil from neighboring fields, and it's going to kind of be falling off your equipment right in, at about 100 meters of that entrance. A lot of guys actually will typically turn to the right, so if you go into your entrance and to the right and start digging up in that area, that would be the first thing I would recommend.
And now, all right, so we're going to do a bit of digging, and we're not likely to find anything here, but we'll show kind of what to do. But tell me a bit about what's on your feet. Why are you wearing that?
On my feet, I have booties, and the reason for this is basically biosecurity. We don't want to be trafficking anything into a field, and we don't want to be trafficking anything out of a field. So before I go into any field, I put these booties on, and before I go out, I take them off and dispose of them.
All right, okay, so let's dig.
Okay. So basically dig and knock off the dirt, and here you can see we have a clean root, but what you'd be looking for is any little bumps or nodules. One thing to remember, we have been getting quite a few samples sent in that are hybridization nodules, and a way to know the difference in the fall is clubroot galls in the fall will be brown and starting to decay, where hybridization nodules will still appear white and firm. But it is important to send in these samples to a lab if you're not sure, and get a positive a test done so you can be sure. So you can clip this here and keep this sample and send that in.
Now, so unfortunately, it has been found in Manitoba. Symptoms have been found in Manitoba, although the risk is still relatively low. We do need to be scouting for it. We need to be thinking about it. What role does variety play in this? Because we do have some tolerant varieties, but is that a fail-safe?
There are very good varieties out there that do have an R rating to clubroot, but like any disease or pest, I wouldn't recommend that growers rely on this. We all know that a breakdown of resistance can happen quite quickly, and I think more important in Manitoba is to learn from our neighbors to the west and try and prevent this from spreading and prevent it from getting into our fields, because we can't rely on genetic resistance, and it is really a long-term management once you get it in your field. So basically trying to stop it from getting in there is our number one priority.
Right, and the resistant varieties still become infected, just not as badly, right?
That's right, and like I said, you don't want to rely on it. It's like blackleg, right? You don't want to rely on varietal resistance because it can break down. So if you are to go into your field and are looking for symptoms above ground, ideally you'd want to go in just prior to swathing, maybe a week or 2 weeks prior to swathing, or right after swathing. So if you're looking for symptoms on the plant, basically it's similar to sclerotinia-like symptoms. What the galls will do is kind of cut off water and nutrient supply to the plant. So essentially it just prematurely ripens. So if you go in two weeks prior to swathing, let's say, you're looking for that bleached kind of prematurely ripened plant. If you're seeing that, obviously it could be blackleg, it could be sclerotinia, or now it could be clubroot. So digging up roots is the best thing to do when you see that.
Okay, so back when I lived in Manitoba for a little while again. Anyway, makes me nostalgic. So one of the reasons I wanted to pull that clip is we can talk about bio booties and how they're just about everywhere now, which I kind of love. But I do want to talk a little bit about scouting for clubroot post-harvest, but also blackleg, as well. And how much, so maybe Jack, I'll start with you. Obviously in Alberta, Clubroot's been there the longest, widest spread. How routine is it that that's sort of an every fall, every canola field test, or is that still pretty rare?
Oh gosh, no. And it was kind of interesting to go back to that video and talking about resistance. And I mean, the comments back are so true. Resistant varieties are not the silver bullet, because the clubroot now is we've got different strains of it, and first generation resistant varieties are no longer really effective in some areas. We're into second generation resistant varieties. And even last year, a big concern in some areas was, again, the grower had a clubroot resistant variety, and they were finding clubroot in their field. So obviously, this is an ongoing battle that we're not going to win just with resistant varieties alone. So there's certainly, they are the mainstay of your management practices, but to solely rely on them, you can't. So yeah. Scouting for clubroot is an ongoing thing. I mean, every grower, every county, every municipality is doing it. Um, typically clubroot is worse in wet years, because again, it's a disease that obviously thrives better when you got more moist conditions. This year might be a little bit harder to discern where clubroot occurred, because again, so much of Alberta was dry, except for some areas farther north. They had very, very reasonable moisture conditions up there. But it's an ongoing battle. Scouting is got to be a yearly thing, and I guess just to tie back to as well, you're talking about the booties and sanitation. Just to tie that back to soil sampling, most agronomists are making sure that they follow clubroot protocols, and that you're when you're soil sampling, what are you doing? You're moving soil. You've got soil probes, you've got tools, you've got quads. Most outfits, and I would say most of them, maintain that some sort of clubroot protocol to sanitize their equipment. One company I worked for previously, we would ensure that we pressure washed our trucks between farms, so that we ensured that we weren't transporting any soil or debris or anything to another farm that would introduce clubroot into any of their fields. Blackleg, they've done a really good job. I think the Canola Council has done a tremendous job of, just about everyone I know now that's a field scout or an agronomist has got their pruning shears with them in their vehicle when they're out checking, and clipping off the base of those canola plants to look for blackleg symptoms. So it's very high on the radar. I think the awareness is really good. We continue to see clubroot spread, so we know that. The practices that we're doing are not bulletproof, but you've got to do everything that you can within reason to limit the spread of this. And again, when I'm sampling a field, I don't want to have a situation where somebody says, "Hey, I never had clubroot before until you soil sample that field." No, I don't want that ever to happen. So not on my watch. I always make sure that we maintain good sanitation. And clean our soil probes, our buckets, everything, just to loop it back into that discussion.
Yeah.
Absolutely. All right, now, and Jason, of course, you're in southern Manitoba, Saskatchewan and Manitoba both, of course, it was expected that we would find it there. We did. This was several years ago. What does the clubroot protocol and scouting protocol look like in southern Manitoba?
Yeah, very similar to what Jack was talking about there. It's trying to have the best biosecurity we can as far as protocols go, but also trying to be as efficient as we can at the same time. So we have brushes for all our assistants, plus our agronomists, to scrub off or remove all the soil off of our quads or our side-by-side going from field to field, trying to be able to do farm by farm, so that we can kind of within that farm, you don't have to maybe necessarily clean off from field to field within that farm, but when you go to a different farm, then you would. And then, of course, using spray 9 to clean off our boots, as well as tires of the quads, and now too the tires of the trucks when we're going into fields for soil sampling. So using all those kind of things. So it's not perfect, but I remember reading from the Canola Council too, doing nothing is not enough either. So we're trying to do whatever we can.
Yeah, doing some is better
Probably
than
one,
good.
one of the things I'll mention though is we talked about clubroot and blackleg. We haven't gone into maybe necessarily a routine of it yet as far as sampling stock or stems after harvest, but it's starting to become more of an issue because we are starting to see more issues with verticillium here
Right.
becoming a
Yeah.
big problem and seeing a lot of differences. And it was very prevalent last year in 2020, not as much here in 2021, although it came on kind of late. But it is something that I think we're going to have to start looking at becoming a routine part of what we do. And then if we do that, then we're also going to be looking at all these other diseases as well.
Right. And that I think is the key point is it's when you see something is determining what it is or what it isn't, right?
Yep.
And that's what it boils down to is um sort of the more things you have to determine what it is or is not means you're going to be out there clipping stems or sampling
Yep.
or those sorts of things and getting a better sense of what's there. But I am glad to hear certainly that in that was 8 years ago. It is essentially commonplace. I think the awareness of biosecurity is much higher than it used to be for sure. And good point about verticillium. I haven't. I've hardly heard of it this year, to be honest. But we definitely, there was quite a bit of an alarm. I think, sort of late last season about it for sure.
Exactly.
So
Yep.
yeah, yeah. But again, as you mentioned, Jack, most diseases prefer damp or moist conditions or humid conditions, and so this year we had some heat, but really no water to speak of. So definitely need all of those things. I did want to say quickly, Ray pointed out how much he enjoys these Monday evenings, and how much he's enjoyed having the two of you on the show, and I will echo that. We're not quite done yet, but I really enjoy these Monday evenings as well. And oh, look at that terrifying frozen face. Anyway, so I really do enjoy getting to talk about some really cool stuff with great people across Canada. And I did want to say to anyone watching or in the comments, we love to have your ideas, your questions come in either through the comments or after the fact. Always great to have follow-up emails, those sorts of things, and ideas for our guests and those sorts of things. So the last clip, and I'm not going to go to it because we don't have time for it, but it was about row spacing for soybeans and those sorts of things. And I want to touch base with you, Jason, a little bit about the evolution of some of these thinking. Have we moved the needle? And this does, of course, relate to even cereals and canola as well. Have
Mhm.
we moved the needle on targeting plant populations versus seeding in bushels per acre? Have we made progress on this because of beans or just in general?
Yeah, I would say yes, we have, and it's in both. So we've done a lot better job, and I think we've gotten a lot further on with growers in determining adequate plant stands based on thousand kernel weight, mortality, all those kind of things, right? So a lot more. We're definitely not there with everyone, but it has progressed quite a bit. When it comes to soybeans, I would say, yeah, we definitely have. So I did watch that video of Terry Buss there, and yeah, he's bang on with that. And I think what's happened though since then is we have really started to see, and we're not there yet, but a lot more progression towards narrower row spacing in soybeans. And I mean, there was a number of years there in the mid 2000s, kind of later 2000s, were always wet. We had issues with mold in soybeans and things like that. Where oh man, 30-inch rows was the way to go because guys had their planters for corn and sunflowers already. And yeah, you can plant, put down a lot less seed when you're going 30-inch rows, so a lower seed cost, and get a little bit more air movement in those rows to help with disease. But what we found though, and I don't know if it's ever going to change back if things get moist, more, more I guess wetter, is the fact that what when we go narrower row spacing, we're doing a lot of things. We're not only just getting I think better emergence, but what we're seeing is more row closure earlier, which does a lot of things. It definitely helps with competition to weeds, and the other thing too is it helps reduce the drying of the soil faster. And when we get into these drier scenarios, that's huge. And I've seen that too, where narrow row spacings out yielded wider rows in a drier year because we've been able to close those rows earlier. What you get with narrower rows too is you got more space between plants within the row. So there's not as much inter-row competition that you see versus a 30-inch row. So those are some things we're starting to see that I think guys are realizing that there's more benefit to going narrow rows. And as Terry mentioned in there too, it is very true that whether you're wide row or narrow row, that final target plant stand is the same, whether you're planting or using a drill. And those are kind of things that I think we're looking at. If you look at even the varieties that are being developed, most of the varieties from most companies are not these big, bushy, aggressive plants. They all maybe have the odd one, but for the most part, they're narrower, semi-bush type varieties that really do better in that, call it 7 to 20-inch row spacing.
Okay. Now, Jack, we have a few minutes left, so I'm going to come back to you because I know the 4R nutrient stewardship platform is one thing that, this is something we really need to be living and breathing, especially as we move through potentially more restrictions on these things. But as agronomists and as growers, this is incredibly key. So what would be maybe your top considerations for agronomists and for growers thinking about 4R stewardship? If 2022 ends up also being, let's say, a dry bias or starts off dry, what should we be considering next spring?
Well, it really ties into our earlier discussion about soil testing and soil sampling because you can't manage what you don't measure. And I've seen some soil test reports that have come across my computer, some significantly high levels of nitrate and phosphate that are in those soil tests, which means that the grower can effectively reduce their fertilizer application rates because they've got that carryover. But that's not a general, I can't make that generalization because I've also seen soil test reports from the same farm where actually they are on the low side. So you can't just make a generalization and say, I'm going to put down 100 pounds of nitrogen and 30 pounds of phosphate and call it good because on some of those fields, they may still be under fertilized. And the other ones, now you've got way too much, which again is not part of the 4R plans. So, managing what we've got. And the other thing is with the incredible high prices of fertilizer we've got, my gosh, if you've got some in the bank, literally in the soil bank, those nutrients, it's like, well, it is like having money in the bank. You've got something you can draw on. You can use what's there in reserve. So for our nutrient stewardship in terms of the right rate, man, that really comes down to using a soil test and getting that soil test report to manage those nutrients. The other thing is when Ross spoke is also doing multiple depths, because where are those nutrients? What portion of the profile are they? Are they shallow or are they leached farther down? Again, that's putting your nutrients and your fertilizer in the right place. So for our nutrient stewardship is so important at this point. And as I say, fertilizer is tremendously expensive this fall. Managing it more efficiently and getting that, what we're striving for is a higher nutrient use efficiency. That's really what 4R is about. We don't want to be wasteful, getting the most ROI we can for that fertilizer dollar, and 4R stewardship just delivers on that.
Yeah,
absolutely. Jason, any words on that?
No, I honestly, Jack summed it up perfectly. I would totally agree with that. And I mean, that's the challenge we face here in Manitoba with higher residual nutrient levels, but with higher fertilizer prices. I mean, this is now the time to really look hard at that and understand what's going on in the soil and realize the soil is not static either. So we have to understand that what's happened, this year has, consequences on what we're going to do for next year.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really appreciate both of you sharing, the differences you've seen between fields of the same farm. So very much, this is not the coming year to do your canola blend of fertilizer and your wheat blend of fertilizer. This is your year to really dial it in because, frankly, A, as you said, Jack, it's the right thing to do environmentally, but B, it's going to be the right thing to do for your pocketbook.
Yep.
Absolutely. Yeah, because
exactly.
it's I hate to say it, everyone, but I don't think it's getting any cheaper. anytime soon. All right. So to Jason and to Jack, thank you both so much. I echo, there's lots of great comments coming in. I echo those absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your time this evening. Pete has one last comment. How many growers in Western Canada are I think it's able to variable rate nutrients? Yeah, are able. Okay, I speak Peter apparently. Then very, if we don't have a lot of time, but very quickly, I know we've done, variable rate nutrients somewhat. There's been work on variable rate fungicide, weed control, all that. Where are we at with nutrients?
That's a really good question. I haven't seen anything recently that would answer that, but let's put it this way. Every new piece of equipment that comes out from a manufacturer is variable rate capable. Let's put it that way. Any of the new air seeders, air drills have got that capability. The question is, how many actually put it into place. I don't have the numbers on that. I'd seen some that said 10 to 25%. I don't know how accurate those are. I guess the one thing though, Lyndsey, I would mention, the one thing that has not changed in over 20 years was the percentage of fields that were soil sampled. It has remained fairly static at around 25%.
That's
only a
crazy.
quarter of fields, and that has always been something that was a little bit shocking to me. Is that we moved the dial on awareness for things like clubroot and blackleg and that sort of thing, but the most recent stuff I've seen, it's remained relatively flat for soil sampling. And man, oh man, this is the year to move that dial.
100%. Yep.
Yeah,
I agree.
Okay, I like that. Although I will also note, perhaps like all technology, we tend to just use that percentage of it that we're comfortable with. That's easy. So the equipment comes with that capability, but my phone can do a lot more things than what I do with it. And so I'm just saying we don't always use technology to the full extent. So we'll see. But bottom line from this whole episode, the take home message, everyone, get those field sampled and get those soil tests in, because we're going to have a very interesting winter of planning ahead of us. All right. On behalf of Jason and Jack, I thank each of you for joining us here on The Agronomists. We will be back next week. I think Sean is hosting next week. We don't have a topic yet, so stay tuned. And of course, tomorrow, head over to realagriculture.com/agronomists to sign up for your CEU credits. So thank you, Jack and Jason, for joining me tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. And cheers, everyone.